Welcome to our deep dive. We're going to be tackling the sociology of sex, gender, and sexuality.
3 big concepts everyone thinks they understand.
Right, but there's always more to learn, especially when we look at things from a sociological perspective, how society shapes these ideas.
And how those ideas in turn shape our individual experiences.
Exactly. Our sources for this deep dive are packed with insights that'll help us untangle it all, so let's jump right in.
Sounds good.
Okay, so our sources kick things off with this really vivid image of a firefighter. Picture this: a burning building and a dramatic rescue. The firefighter emerges from the smoke. Now, who do you picture?
I'd probably imagine a man, to be honest.
Right, like it's almost automatic. It's like for centuries, firefighting has been seen as like this tough, masculine job.
Exactly. It was considered an exclusively male profession for a very long time.
But here's the thing. The sources use this image to kind of challenge our assumptions. Like, what if, when that helmet comes off?
What if it's a woman?
Boom. It makes you stop and think, right?
Mm.
Like how much we just automatically associate certain roles with certain genders.
Yeah, it exposes those deeply ingrained assumptions we have about gender roles, even in a profession where, on the surface, it shouldn't matter.
Totally. And this actually leads perfectly into like the fundamental distinction between sex and gender, which is like Sociology 101.
But it's crucial for understanding this whole topic.
Okay, so remind us, like, what's the difference?
So sex refers to the biological differences between males and females. We're talking about things like chromosomes, hormones, reproductive organs, like the physical stuff.
Gotcha, the biology. And gender is like...
Gender is more about the roles, the behaviors, and traits that society associates with being male or female. So it's not about your body, it's about how you're expected to act based on what's between your legs.
So sex is rooted in biology, but gender is like more of a social construct.
Exactly. It's created and reinforced by society. And here's the key point. Someone's sex doesn't automatically determine their gender.
Right, like someone assigned male at birth might not identify with like masculine traits or roles.
Precisely. And that disconnect can cause a lot of internal conflict and can challenge those traditional gender norms that society tries to impose on us.
It's wild when you think about it. The sources mention that the terms sex and gender weren't even formally distinguished until the 1950s.
It shows you how our understanding of these concepts is constantly changing and evolving.
Yeah, and there's even legal debates surrounding these terms. Like the sources talk about how Supreme Court Justices Scalia and Ginsburg, like brilliant legal minds.
Yeah, and they had very different views on how sex and gender should be used in legal contexts.
Okay, so what was the debate about?
So Scalia believed sex was strictly biological and gender was strictly social, like a clear separation. But Ginsburg, she deliberately blurred those lines, especially when she was arguing cases related to gender discrimination, because she recognized that the social impacts of gender can't always be separated from biological sex. You can't just ignore one or the other.
So even word choice, like just the words we use, can have a huge impact on how we understand these issues.
Absolutely. Language matters. Now, moving beyond those basic definitions, let's delve into gender identity.
Ooh, yes. Gender identity.
This is deeply personal, right? It's how individuals perceive and experience their own gender, regardless of their sex assigned at birth.
Makes sense.
And this is where we get into the concept of transgender individuals, where their assigned sex and gender identity don't align.
Right, and the sources define some important terms here, like transgender man and transgender woman.
It's important to get the language right. A transgender man is someone assigned female at birth, but who identifies as a man, and vice versa for a transgender woman.
So it's about who you are on the inside, not what your body looks like.
Exactly. And then there's transitioning, which is something that some, but not all, transgender people may choose to go through. It's about aligning their lives with their gender identity. And this can involve social changes like changing your name or pronouns, legal changes like updating documents, or medical aspects like hormone therapy or surgery.
So it's not like one set path that everyone follows. It's a very individual and personal journey.
Absolutely.
And I think it's important to point out that language is constantly evolving, so it's important to be open to learning and using the terms that people use to identify themselves.
Yeah, respect is key. And speaking of language, there are terms like cisgender and cisnormativity that are really important to understand.
Break those down for us.
Okay, so cisgender refers to people whose gender identity aligns with the sex they were assigned at birth. So basically the opposite of transgender.
Gotcha. And cisnormativity.
Cisnormativity takes that a step further. It's the assumption that everyone is cisgender, making it the norm. And this often leads to the experiences of transgender people being overlooked or even completely erased, like their identities just don't exist.
It's like society is built around this idea that everyone's gender identity matches their sex assigned at birth.
Right, which makes it harder for anyone who doesn't fit that mold. And it's not just about being aware of different identities, it's about challenging those assumptions that are baked into our language and our institutions.
It's about recognizing the diversity of human experience and making sure everyone feels seen and validated.
Exactly. Now, we've talked about sex, gender identity, but there's another big piece to this puzzle: sexuality and sexual orientation.
Okay, let's dive into that.
So sexuality is basically the capacity for sexual feelings and attraction. And within that, we have this whole spectrum of sexual orientations.
And it feels like we're moving away from those old school rigid categories, right?
We are. The sources mention so many different orientations: heterosexuality, homosexuality, bisexuality, pansexuality, omnisexuality, asexuality, even queer as like an umbrella term.
It's a lot.
It is. And it's important to remember that these all exist on a spectrum, and self-identification is super important. So, instead of trying to fit people into neat little boxes, it's about respecting how individuals define their own experiences and attractions.
Makes sense. So someone might identify as bisexual or pansexual.
Or something else entirely. It's not about labeling, it's about respecting people's self-identified orientations.
Totally. And while we're talking about this, the sources mention something called romantic orientation. What's that about?
It's a separate but related concept. For example, someone who identifies as aromantic might not experience romantic attraction, even though they might still have sexual desires. So it's not as simple as just sexual orientation. It's about recognizing that attraction can be complex and multifaceted.
So someone could be asexual, meaning they don't experience sexual attraction.
Right.
But they could still have a romantic orientation. Like they might still want to be in a romantic relationship.
Exactly. It highlights how complex human relationships and attraction can be. We also have orientations like demisexuality, which is another great example.
Demisexuality, what's that one?
So demisexual individuals only experience sexual attraction after forming a strong emotional bond with someone, regardless of gender. So it's not about looks or first impressions, it's about that deeper connection.
That's really interesting. It challenges that whole narrative about attraction being like instant and based on superficial things.
It does. And it's important to remember that even with all this progress in understanding and accepting different sexual orientations, heteronormativity is still a very real thing in our society.
Right. Heteronormativity. That assumption that everyone is straight.
Exactly. And this often leads to the othering of LGBTQ plus individuals, which can be really damaging. Like their experiences are invalidated. They're made to feel like they don't belong.
It can be really harmful, especially for young people who are just trying to figure themselves out.
Absolutely. And the sources talk about some other interesting concepts here, like the Kinsey scale and Sedgwick's idea of homosocial. Have you heard of those?
Not really. Can you explain?
So the Kinsey scale, think of it like a sliding scale from exclusively heterosexual to exclusively homosexual. Now, it has its flaws, but it was pretty groundbreaking back in the day for showing that sexuality is more of a continuum than just two opposite categories.
So it's not just black and white. There's a whole lot of gray in between.
Right. And then Sedgwick argued that even those categories are too limiting, especially for women. She explored how society often restricts expressions of same-sex attraction, particularly for men, and argued that we need to move beyond those limitations to really understand the full range of human experience.
It's about breaking down those rigid categories and recognizing the fluidity of human sexuality.
Exactly.
Wow, this is a lot to process. And we haven't even touched on how gender roles are actually learned.
We haven't. Or how they contribute to social inequalities.
We'll definitely have to dive into those aspects next time.
Absolutely. There's so much more to explore.
It's amazing how these topics are all interconnected.
They really are.
This is why we love doing these deep dives.
Me too. Always something new to discover. Okay, so we've laid the groundwork. We know about sex, gender, and all the different ways people identify.
We've talked about sexual orientation and how it's not always so black and white.
Exactly. But now let's think about how all of this actually plays out in our lives.
Yeah.
How do we learn to be men and women? How do we internalize these gender roles?
The sources are super clear about this. It all starts from the moment we're born.
From day one.
It's that process of socialization that shapes how we understand what it means to be a boy or girl in our society.
And it's often so subtle we don't even realize it's happening. Think about something as simple as baby clothes. Pink for girls, blue for boys.
Yeah, like those are the classic baby colors.
Right. And it seems harmless enough, but it's an early example of how we start associating certain colors with specific genders.
It's like we're already setting expectations before the baby can even say mama or dada.
Exactly. And it's not just colors. The types of toys we give kids also play a huge role. Boys get trucks and action figures, things that encourage movement and competition.
Right, and girls get dolls and play kitchens, things that focus on nurturing and domesticity.
It's like we're subconsciously guiding them toward these predetermined roles.
It's all about shaping their behavior, even from a very young age.
And then there's the language we use. Phrases like, boys will be boys, to justify aggressive behavior.
Oh yeah, that one drives me crazy.
Right. It sends the message that certain behaviors are okay, even expected just because you're a boy.
But girls are supposed to be nice and quiet.
Exactly. It limits how boys are allowed to express themselves emotionally.
So we're not just shaping their play, we're shaping their entire emotional landscape.
Precisely. And all of this early socialization has this cumulative effect. It leads to something sociologists call occupational sorting.
Occupational sorting.
Basically, it's how gender stereotypes influence what careers people choose later in life.
So those early messages about what's appropriate for boys and girls end up shaping their career paths.
Absolutely. Think about fields like STEM science, technology, engineering, and math.
Still seen as male-dominated.
They are, even though there's no reason why women can't excel in those areas.
It's like those stereotypes become self-fulfilling prophecies.
Sadly, yes. And on the flip side, we have caregiving professions like nursing and teaching, which are often seen as more feminine.
Which is interesting because those are essential jobs.
They are, but they're often undervalued and underpaid because they're associated with women's work.
And that ties into the gender pay gap.
Yeah, it does. Women are often concentrated in lower-paying jobs while men dominate the higher-paying fields. And then there's the motherhood penalty.
Oh, I've heard of that. What exactly is it?
It's the disadvantage that women face in the workplace after having kids.
So they might be passed over for promotions or seen as less committed to their jobs?
Exactly. They're often perceived as less competent or less available, even if they're just as dedicated as their male colleagues.
It's like motherhood becomes a liability.
It's so unfair. And here's the kicker. Men often experience the opposite of fatherhood premium.
Wait, so becoming a dad can actually boost a man's career?
It often does. They're seen as more responsible, more stable, more likely to provide for their family.
It's a complete double standard.
It is, and it all comes back to those deep-seated societal expectations about gender roles.
Like women are still expected to be the primary caregivers, even when they work outside the home.
Right, and this all feeds into a bigger issue. Gender stratification.
So what does that mean in sociological terms?
Basically, it's the unequal distribution of resources, power, and opportunities based on gender. It's not just about individual biases. It's about a system that disadvantages women in all areas of life.
So we're talking about a systemic problem, not just isolated incidents.
Exactly. And the gender pay gap is just one piece of the puzzle. There's also the glass ceiling.
That invisible barrier that prevents women from reaching top leadership positions.
Right. There are so many factors that contribute to it. Stereotypes about women leaders, lack of mentorship opportunities, and, yeah, that bias against working mothers we talked about.
And then there's politics. Women are still vastly underrepresented in government, even though they make up more than half the population.
The numbers are shockingly low, and this lack of representation impacts everything from policy decisions to how women are perceived in society.
So we've made some progress, but there's clearly a long way to go.
Agreed. But thankfully, there have been movements dedicated to fighting for gender equality. Let's talk about the rise of feminism and its impact.
Okay, let's do that. What do the sources say about the feminist movement?
They start with Betty Friedan and her book, The Feminine Mystique. Imagine what it was like for women in the 1950s, expected to find fulfillment only in being wives and mothers.
Like their whole identity was wrapped up in domesticity.
Exactly. And Friedan challenged that narrow definition of women's roles. Her book was like a lightning rod, igniting the modern feminist movement.
It's amazing how one book can spark such a huge cultural shift.
It's true. And her work was instrumental in the formation of the National Organization for Women, or NW.
NW.
Yeah, I've heard of them. They really set a powerful agenda for the movement, advocating for women's equal participation in all aspects of American life.
So, equal pay, reproductive rights, protection from discrimination.
All of that. And their activism led to real change. The sources highlight key milestones like Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion.
A landmark case for sure.
And then there were amazing women like Patsy Mink and Shirley Chisholm who fought tirelessly for women's rights within the political system.
Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman elected to Congress.
A true trailblazer. She faced so much adversity but never backed down from fighting for social justice.
Such an inspiring figure.
And her legacy continues to inspire activists today.
It does. But the fight for equality doesn't stop with women's rights. The sources also address the ongoing struggle for LGBTQ+ rights.
Absolutely. And it's a struggle that's deeply connected to everything we've been talking about. Gender roles, societal norms, it's all intertwined.
The sources actually provide some pretty sobering statistics from the FBI about the rise of hate crimes against LGBTQ+ people.
It's a stark reminder that prejudice and discrimination are still very much alive.
It's heartbreaking. And it highlights how homophobia and transphobia can have real consequences for people's lives.
They can lead to violence, discrimination, denial of basic human rights.
It's constant struggle.
But amidst those challenges, there have also been some major victories. The sources mention the overturning of Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
Right, so gay and lesbian people could finally serve openly in the military.
A huge step forward. And then there was the landmark Obergefell v. Hodges case, which legalized same-sex marriage nationwide.
I remember that one. It felt like a turning point.
It was. These victories have changed countless lives. But the sources also emphasize that the fight for LGBTQ+ equality is far from over.
There's still so much work to do.
Right. Combating discrimination in areas like housing and healthcare, ensuring legal protections, promoting acceptance within families and communities.
It's an ongoing battle.
It is, and it's a battle that's intimately connected to the fight for gender equality. They're two sides of the same coin.
It feels like everything we've talked about so far is connected in some way.
It is. And now that we've laid out the complexities of sex, gender, sexuality, and all the social forces that shape them, let's turn our attention to how sociologists actually make sense of these issues.
Okay, so how do they approach these topics?
They use these things called theoretical perspectives. It's like looking at the world through different lenses, each one offering a unique way of understanding these complex social dynamics.
So what are some of those lenses?
Well, the sources highlight three main ones: structural functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism.
Okay, let's start with structural functionalism. What's that all about?
Imagine society as this big machine with all these interconnected parts, each playing a specific role to keep things running smoothly.
Sounds kind of like a well-oiled machine.
That's the basic idea. And when it comes to gender, structural functionalism views those traditional gender roles, men as providers, women as caregivers, as functional for maintaining social order.
So it's like everyone has their place, and that keeps society stable.
Right. But you can probably already see the limitations.
It's a very traditional view of gender roles.
It is, and it doesn't really account for how those roles can create inequality.
Which is where conflict theory comes in.
Exactly. Conflict theory sees society as characterized by competition and conflict over resources and power. And when you look at gender through this lens, it's all about the power struggle between men and women.
So instead of harmony and stability, it's all about who has the upper hand.
Right. Conflict theorists argue that men, as the historically dominant group, have created systems that benefit them at the expense of women.
So men control the resources, make the rules, and women are left fighting for scraps.
It's a pretty bleak view, but it explains a lot of the persistent inequalities we see.
It's a reminder that power dynamics are always at play, even when we don't realize it.
Exactly. And then there's symbolic interactionism. This one takes a more micro-level approach, focusing on how we create meaning through symbols and language.
So it's less about the big picture of society and more about how we interact with each other on a daily basis.
Exactly. This perspective is all about how we do gender in our everyday lives.
Do gender. What does that mean?
It's about the subtle ways we communicate our gender identity, the expectations we have of others based on their perceived gender, and how those interactions reinforce or challenge social norms.
So like how we dress, how we talk, how we stand, those are all ways of performing our gender.
Absolutely. It's like we're all actors on a stage, constantly sending and receiving cues about who we are.
And that ties into the idea of the looking glass self that we talked about earlier.
Right. Our sense of self is shaped by how we think others see us, and those perceptions are heavily influenced by societal expectations.
So we internalize those messages about gender and then act accordingly.
It's a powerful cycle, and it can be really limiting.
It makes you realize how much of our behavior is influenced by these unspoken social scripts.
And those scripts can have real consequences, reinforcing stereotypes and contributing to feelings of otherness.
It's a lot to think about.
It is. But these theoretical perspectives give us valuable tools for understanding how gender operates in society.
They help us see the world in new ways.
Exactly. And the sources also touch on some more specialized theories, like queer theory, which really challenges those rigid categories we've been talking about.
Oh yeah, queer theory. I've heard a little about it, but I'd love to learn more.
It's fascinating. It pushes us to question the very categories we use to define ourselves. It's about moving beyond those traditional binaries of male, female, heterosexual, homosexual, and embracing a more fluid and nuanced understanding of gender and sexuality.
So it's not just about challenging stereotypes, it's about questioning the entire system that creates those stereotypes in the first place.
Exactly. Queer theory is about deconstructing those taken-for-granted assumptions and embracing the full spectrum of human expression.
It's about breaking free from those restrictive boxes.
Right, and acknowledging the diversity and complexity of human experience.
I love that.
It's liberating, isn't it?
It is. I feel like this deep dive is already helping me see these issues in a whole new light.
That's great to hear. We're starting to get a clearer picture of how all of these seemingly separate issues are actually interconnected.
It's like a giant web. Everything is related in some way.
Exactly, and we're just beginning to unravel it. So we've covered a ton of ground, right? Sex, gender, socialization, inequality, even those different theoretical perspectives.
Yeah, it's been quite the deep dive. But I feel like we're missing something. Like we've talked about individuals and society, but what about culture? How does culture shape our views on sexuality?
That's a great point. And the sources definitely address this. They emphasize how different societies have vastly different ideas about what's considered normal or acceptable when it comes to sexual attitudes and behaviors.
So what might be taboo in one culture could be totally fine in another.
Exactly. It's all relative. The sources actually use the example of Scandinavian countries, which tend to have a much more liberal view of premarital sex compared to the United States.
Interesting. So even countries that share a lot of values can have very different perspectives on sexuality.
Absolutely. It highlights how deeply ingrained cultural norms can be. And speaking of the U.S., the sources suggest that despite its image as this progressive nation, it actually holds more conservative views on sexuality compared to many other industrialized countries.
Really? That's surprising.
Think about attitudes towards premarital sex, extramarital affairs, even homosexuality. The U.S. tends to be more restrictive in those areas compared to, say, Western European countries.
I guess I hadn't really thought about it that way before. It's a good reminder that our own cultural norms aren't the only way to see things.
Right. It's all about perspective. And within those cultural norms, there's another persistent issue, the sexual double standard.
Oh yeah, the double standard. I think everyone's experienced that one at some point.
It's the idea that women are judged more harshly than men for engaging in casual sex or having multiple partners.
So men can sow their wild oats, but women are supposed to be more chaste.
It's like those outdated ideas about good girls and bad boys are still influencing how we judge people's sexual behavior.
It's so unfair.
It is. And it can have real consequences for women, impacting their self-esteem, their relationships, even their safety.
It's a reminder that these social norms aren't just abstract ideas. They have a real impact on people's lives.
Absolutely. Now, shifting gears a bit, the sources also touch on the ongoing debate about sex education in the U.S.
Ah, yeah, that's a hot topic for sure.
There are strong opinions on both sides. The sources point out that while most Americans actually support comprehensive sex education, there's still a big push for abstinence-only programs in certain communities.
It's like some people are afraid that if we teach kids about sex, they'll just go out and have it.
That's the logic behind abstinence-only education. But here's the thing. Research suggests that these programs can actually be counterproductive.
So they might actually lead to higher rates of teen pregnancy and STIs.
Exactly. Because young people aren't equipped with the knowledge and skills to make informed decisions about their sexual health.
So it's not about scaring kids into abstinence. It's about empowering them with accurate information.
Right. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to sex. And speaking of knowledge, the sources mention a fascinating study from the 1970s that looked at gender stereotypes among mental health professionals.
Wait, even therapists and psychologists?
Even them. Researchers asked them to describe the characteristics of a healthy person, and guess what? The traits they listed were almost identical to those traditionally associated with a healthy male.
So being female was basically seen as less healthy.
That was the implication. And what's even more concerning is that similar studies conducted decades later found similar results. It shows how persistent these biases are, even among people who should be challenging them.
Wow, it's a reminder that we all have blind spots, no matter how educated or enlightened we think we are.
Exactly. And that's why sociology is so important. It's about using research and critical thinking to understand the social world, question our assumptions, and work towards a more just and equitable society.
I think this deep dive has definitely done that. We've explored so much.
We've only just scratched the surface, but hopefully it's given you a better understanding of how all of these issues are interconnected.
It definitely has. And I think the most important takeaway is that this is just the beginning. There's always more to learn and more to discuss.
Absolutely. So as you continue learning and thinking about these topics, here's a final question for you to ponder. Knowing that gender is a social construct, how can we challenge and change those harmful stereotypes that limit opportunities for everyone?
That's a great question, and one that we should all be thinking about. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating deep dive into the sociology of sex, gender, and sexuality.